Welcome everyone. Dear guests, I would like to invite you to our interactive session on justice in global supply chains. My name is Georg Weininger and I've been advising trade union organizations on development cooperation for the past 4 years as part of the Agency for Business and Economic Development. We came here 3 years after the German Supply Chain Act has come into force, and roughly 1 year after the European Directive on Supply Chains has been adopted, and still the debate on mandatory supply chain regulation has not lost in its heat at all. In this event, we want to focus on the perspective of those who meant to be protected by these laws, the workers along global supply chains. Together with my distinguished guests on the panel, I invite you to explore the question: what impact do these regulations really have on workers' rights and trade union co-determination? I have the honor now to introduce my guests. On my left-hand side is Miriam-Lena from the International Department of DGB and head of the unit of global supply chains. It's great to have you. Left to her, it's Darius Sivin from the United Automobile, Aerospace and Agricultural Implement Workers of America, UAW. Welcome, Darius.
Thank you.
And if this wasn't enough, we have won over Kelly Faye Rodriguez, a long-standing advocate for international workers' rights and the newly appointed director of the Human Rights Due Diligence Competence. Welcome. So, before I hand over to the experts, I would like to ask all of you in the room and online, hopefully, to answer one question. The whole conference is entitled with the big word justice, in German Gerechtigkeit, and I would like to ask you to type the word that comes to mind if you think of justice in relation to global supply chains. You should be able to do this at this link. So the question, once again, type in the word that comes to mind if you think of justice in global supply chains. And we should be able to see words popping up. Oh, that's awesome. That's a good start, I think. Solidarity, equality, quite positive. Fight, fairness. In existence, yeah. There is some downsides to that. Not achieved. Struggle. Labor unions. All right. Decent work. Yeah, that's those big key words, right? I guess we keep that for a second, and I would open the panel. For expert inputs, I would start with you, Miriam-Lena. So seeing all that word cloud with words like power imbalance or utopia, solidarity, or collaboration, maybe you can paint a slightly different picture. So my question to you is, why is co-determination key to implementing supply chain laws? And which are the main opportunities and obstacles?
Yeah, thank you, Georg. That's a really relevant question, especially now that we do see quite a heavy political backlash that is also kind of symbolized in some of the words that we see here. But yeah, let me start a bit different. I think there is quite a variety of aspects to why co-determination is really important in the implementation of these laws. So first of all, of course, there is the aspect of practical knowledge that is brought from trade unions, that is brought from works councils, because supply chains are, of course, really complex. And laws like the German Supply Chain Act, but also the upcoming EU directive, can only work if implementation goes beyond box ticking. And worker representatives see, of course, on the ground things that management alone overlooks. So wage dumping, unsafe conditions, or union busting, that can only be, or legislation has to be used on the ground. And works councils and employee representatives now have a legal basis. Well, at least we hope that this will stick to demand transparency about working conditions in supply chains. Then I would also like to underline that prevention and participation are closely interlinked. So these laws give us a chance to shape solutions before violations occur. So workers and works councils know what to look for. They also have, contrary to what is being discussed politically, zero interest in unnecessary bureaucracy. So this creates a shared interest actually with employers to have practical and efficient compliance. And examples already show that when unions are included in audits or sustainability committees, monitoring actually becomes credible and also preventive. Of course, there is an aspect also of trust and legitimacy. So due diligence processes, as I already kind of said before, work better when they are not imposed top-down. So workers trust their representatives, and empirically complaints are more likely to be filed because employees feel secure to approach their works councils or their representatives. And this trust, of course, also increases legitimacy. And corrective measures are then actually more likely to be implemented. And for us, of course, as DGB, the global cooperation aspect is a really important one too. So co-determination in the implementation of due diligence laws links the German works councils, for example, more closely with trade unions abroad. And this transnational cooperation, of course, also creates a really powerful alliance for human rights along the entire supply chain. Of course, for trade unions, there is quite some opportunities, but also some obstacles in this whole process. So I think from these new laws, new leverage arises. So unions and also works councils have a new legal hook to demand information through economic committees, supervisory boards, and also through dialogue with management, of course, and more generally, meaningful stakeholder engagement. So this wording comes from the EU directive, actually, gives them the leverage to become an equal partner in the implementation of the laws on company level. And of course, this then turns the abstract obligations into very concrete accountability. Also, they do have the chance to raise standards beyond compliance, I would say. So co-determination allows for unions to shift the debate from avoiding liability to creating fair globalization. For example, linking board remunerations to sustainability KPIs, as some supervisory board representatives already do, shows how workers can push human rights into corporate governance. And on top of that, I would say that despite the current debate, civil society still expects fair working conditions in global supply chains, right? So unions can also position themselves as partners of responsible business and strengthen both legitimacy and also consumer trust in the end. And the obstacles that we as DGB see, I kind of already alluded to them. There's a heavy political backlash currently ongoing. It began as corporate resistance, framing the whole due diligence, like every single due diligence measure, and especially the laws as bureaucratic overreach. And this narrative has, of course, also stuck with political actors in Brussels and Berlin, and this is what we're seeing unfolding currently. And of course, this is watering down the laws. First, it started with a watering down on the rhetoric level, but recently we've seen the BAFA being cut down in many ways as the appointed authority that should actually implement also sanctions. They cannot sanction any longer. The reporting has been cut down. And of course, this is undermining the credibility and also the effectiveness of the entire framework. On top of that, I would say that there is information gaps still. And I think that's also something that is maybe important in what Kelly is going to say. In practice, value chains are, of course, as I mentioned, extremely complex. So trade unions abroad might still know that there are new laws in place, but they might not know how to use them. And I think that's quite an important gap that still needs to be closed. And on top of that, of course, the enforcement is still relatively weak, also given the political backlash. But even if the laws, the EU directive and also the German Supply Chain Act came into force as they stand on paper currently, they do not explicitly mandate co-determination in due diligence processes. And without strong oversight, of course, and sanctions, worker participation risks remaining symbolic. One really important aspect is also that due diligence laws cannot solve it all. So if in some countries the enabling rights are not in place, are not being implemented, if trade unions are threatened or not even allowed, like like we hear from Myanmar, for example, that there's a heavy, extreme backlash going on. Companies cannot solve that, of course. We need to keep that in mind, that this is not the solution to everything. So to conclude a bit, co-determination can be the bridge between abstract laws and real change. Thank you.
Great insights. Not the most positive picture, but great insight, thanks. And having that strategic view, I would like to turn to a bit more, something more practical. Darius, would you be willing to walk us through the BAFA complaint your union is bringing to BAFA? And my questions, maybe for the back of your head already, is how were the risks identified, and how did you make use of grievance mechanisms, and of course, which challenges did you face?
Okay, just a brief comment on risks. U.S. unions find the term funny because anytime you begin to organize anywhere, there is essentially 100% certainty that management will come back with a union-busting campaign. Risk is the probability of harm, and here we're talking about the certainty of harm. So the very idea, all we have to know is that we're going to try to organize something, at least especially in the private sector. So from our point of view, we're not talking about risk, we're talking about certainty. I do want to speak a bit as to why does a U.S. union need to use this law. Specifically, I find that audiences from any country where a social democratic party is frequently in power do not understand how backwards the United States is. So U.S. labor law has never actually met ILO standards, and in either its provisions or its enforcement. And I'll give a few examples about that. It is perfectly legal to hire a union avoidance firm, to do covert surveillance of employees, to do data analytics, to essentially prohibit free speech in the workplace. We have a First Amendment to our Constitution, which has free speech guarantees. It is specifically a limit on what the government may do. That's been violated a lot since January 20th, but that's an entirely separate conversation. So in addition to that, the penalties for illegal activities, such as firing or retaliating against union supporters, closing unionized facilities, threatening or reducing benefits, using stalling contracts and contract negotiations, or the recently made illegal captive audience meetings are very weak, and I'll give you one example of this. If I get fired for participating in a union organizing drive, and I file a complaint with the National Labor Relations Board, and the board decides to bring my complaint, a year or two after the drive, it will win for me, from the company, my back wages, minus any money that I've made working elsewhere in between. No punitive damages on the company. The company's also required to offer me my job back in a now non-union workplace because it has successfully busted the union drive by firing and keeping the organizers of the union out for 2 years. And my back wages and the back wages of a handful of other people, minus what we've earned elsewhere, are the cost of doing business. That's all before January 20th, 2025. In addition to that, we have now seen the President of the United States fire members of the National Labor Relations Board without cause, leading to a lack of a quorum, which has simply prevented the board from being able to make decisions. In addition, as part of a more general move to bring all agencies which by law are independent under the control of the presidency, this administration has blocked legal positions taken by the board with which it disagrees, unprecedentedly required White House approval for board regulations, which has always been done by executive agencies but never by independent agencies. So EPA regulations have always required White House approval, or more or less, but independent agencies, Federal Trade Commission, National Labor Relations Board, are never until this administration, and it has inserted liaisons in the agency to block or monitor agency activities. Finally, there's a lawsuit by Elon Musk, which was the Fifth Circuit ruled that basically the independence of the National Labor Relations Board is likely to be unconstitutional, which is against 90 years of jurisprudence, but it's a very right-wing circuit. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court in its current state may uphold this. This allows other big companies, no matter where they are in the country, to do jurisdiction shopping, go to the Fifth Circuit, and also get cases by the board against them blocked. So that's our current state of affairs and why we might need international help. So I'm going to go through a few examples of what Mercedes has done. I'm starting with the most egregious. They fired an employee with cancer. This person specifically had permission to have his cell phone on the shop floor because he was having trouble getting his medications in case his doctor or the pharmacy called. He was then fired for essentially having his cell phone on the shop floor. We believe that's because he was a union supporter, and we filed that case with the National Labor Relations Board. Michael Goebel, the CEO of Mercedes, sent a letter to all the employees basically telling them not to sign union cards, which is the first step in a union election, and then eventually not to vote For the union, quoted there in this slide, you can see some implying language and some explanation on my part as to why this language would be reasonably taken by any worker who received it as oppose unionization. The CEO wants me to oppose unionization. So this is a very small part of what they did in their campaign against unionization. In June, I did about a 20-minute presentation to the Industrial Human Rights Due Diligence Conference in Berlin, which basically was 20 minutes just basically about what Mercedes did. 60% of the workers are African American. They have an African American legislature tell them the plant might close. It would be directly illegal if an employer made that threat. The status of having someone come into the plant to make that threat is somewhat less clear. They actually rated workers based on how pro-union they were and provided that information to the union busting consultant, who both targeted messages and targeted small group meetings based on that. They held mandatory anti-union meetings, which have only recently been made illegal, using horror stories. And 2 weeks before the election, they changed the CEO, which is a common practice. Basically, everything bad that's happened since you announced your unionization, you blame on somebody who's no longer there, and then you ask people to vote no and give the new guy a chance. It's actually one of the tactics recommended by union busting consultants. So we filed the case with BAFA on April 3rd. We used a very helpful document prepared by IG Metall that tracks the BAFA online form very closely. So we were able to prepare it offline and then enter it. It was extremely helpful on their part. Claudia Rahman of IG Metall sent it to us. It was very helpful. We issued a press release on filing because we understood that a large part of the impact of the case was that Mercedes didn't want to have bad publicity. Certainly, we hope that by filing it about 6 weeks before the election, BAFA would do something that might change Mercedes' behavior before the election. Right in the middle of the 4-day voting period, they finally announced that, yeah, we had a legitimate case and they were going to take it up. So basically, we did not get action in the timely manner that we hoped we would. We were unable to win the election due to all the practices I've described and many more that didn't fit into this presentation. And despite all this, 44% of the workers did vote for the union. So we did get a pretty good initial response, which was BAFA communicated with the labor attaché at the German embassy, who contacted both the union and the company. We heard that there might be a report to the German government. If there has been a report to the German government, it was internal, and we don't know what it says, and we don't know whether it exists or not. Here's some of our interaction with BAFA. We sent a memo explaining the weaknesses of the NLRB, essentially going over a lot of what I did, why we need international help. And following with a more detailed memo on the structural procedural weaknesses. Oh, we also explained the cases the specific ULPs we had brought before the NLRB. And then, of course, our BAFA case included things that the NLRB doesn't even regard as illegal. And we also discussed the limitations with regard to enforcing Mercedes' own corporate policies, which on paper look really good. And in September of 2024, we actually had a meeting with BAFA. They requested additional information in January. We provided it, affidavits and other supporting documents. Again, a further explanation between the relationship between our NLRB filings and our BAFA complaint, and a memo from an international lawyer who also serves on the ILO governing body. And that memo emphasized the need for effective remedies and timely enforcement. pointed out the lack of sufficient penalties in the U.S. And discussed ILO jurisprudence with regard to many of the things in our complaint. Despite this, 10 months after we filed with BAFA, Mercedes was so unaffected by the filing that they felt free to fire Jeremy Kimbrell. That picture there is directly taken from a website that was put up before the election. The reason why I point that out is that sometimes companies plead ignorance. They say, oh yeah, we disciplined this person. We had no idea they were a union supporter. It was on a website. He spoke to the press. It's not possible that they didn't know. As indicated here, he had no previous disciplinary record. The pretense was something like he was out of his own area during a time when he was supposed to be doing the job they paid him for. And that's generally not a first-time firing offense. We, of course, communicated the facts surrounding his firing to BAFA, but I think one of the key takeaways is they'd been investigating this thing 10 months, and it had so little impact on Mercedes that they felt free to do this. We have since hired DKI Law Firm to assist us. Anna Gilsbach is in the audience. Thank you. And we hope this will improve BAFA's responsiveness. And, there was one more summary slide that I sent yesterday that apparently...
Maybe you can move it out of your head.
All right. So my summary takeaway points are, one, that U.S. labor law and its enforcement are insufficient. Two, what little we had is seriously suffering under the current administration. Three, we had been really hoping that BAFA would intervene in some effective way before the election to reduce the illegal anti-union campaign. Violates in many cases U.S. law, and where it doesn't violate U.S. law, it violates international standards, and so that we would have somewhat of a fair election. Four, not only did they not do that, but 10 months after we filed, their investigation was so ineffective that they felt free to fire a well-known union supporter.
Wow. Thank you, Darius, even though the message is not too positive in that case. I would now like to turn to you, Kelly. Mm-hmm. I saw you were listening closely, and I mean, the case concerns an industrially advanced and democratically constituted country. As you're nodding halfway, as the head of a new organization dedicated to workers' rights in global supply chains, how do you think the Competence Center can support trade unions in such future cases, even if they operate in less developed economies?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. And I mean, this is sobering, right? This is the reality of workers organizing in the US and certainly in countries around the world. We know union busting happens everywhere. There's violence against workers. Workers are killed for organizing. And there's forced labor on the rise, even in developed countries, in the private sector, right? Like, these are struggles that we all face. And at the same time, we know that workers will continue to organize, and they will always continue to try to find avenues and ways to improve their lives, their conditions collectively. And so I think with the center, our approach is, look, laws on the books, we've learned a lot over the years, where there's going to be opportunities for leverage for us to exploit, to try to level the playing field and balance the power, rebalance the power imbalance that exists in all workplaces, right? And laws are very important. The due diligence, increasing efforts to pass due diligence laws, mandatory due diligence shows that there's consensus and awareness and understanding that we have to have mandatory rules. We have to have requirements for business practices in order to actually finally make progress and address some of the long-standing violations that continue to occur. But then again, laws are only one tool in the toolbox for workers that need to organize. The center's approach is really that workers in the US, but also across the global South, really need the resources. They need to understand the opportunities available for advocacy and to be able to put those tools to practice for their organizing goals, to be able to raise standards. So we've learned, I really like the idea of thinking about co-determinants for justice, right? We often talk about it as co-governance. We know what models work. We know that when there's workers at the table with companies, that is a sure, reliable way to achieve more resilient supply chains, to prevent violations from occurring, and then when they do, to be able to have remedy that serves a purpose, right? That reverses the chilling effect that exists in so many sectors and economies when workers' rights are violated. And so being able to share resources to educate workers in a variety of settings around the various tools available, whether it's due diligence laws, whether it's trade laws, whether it is new guidelines for responsible business conduct, and also show the models that work. We have GFAs, global framework agreements. We have binding agreements in supply chains. Again, increasingly, the trends we're learning is that you need to have the big brands, the suppliers, but also the buyers at the table, and they need to feel the incentive to be involved in preventative measures and in remediation. Coming out of the U.S., we are testing new models, right? We've got trade agreements where American brands, major auto sector companies, are being held accountable, and it hits their pocket, right? Like their tariff benefits are on the line if there's violations in the supplier companies in Mexico, for example. And those kinds of models, whether it's the International Accord or these trade agreements that really embed, they have teeth to be able to enforce the various actors across the supply chain coming together with workers to, again, prevent and create remediation models that will respect rights. That's really what it's about, and workers across the supply chain, across the global South, really are hungry to learn and to access and to put into practice these new tools so that they can have agency in their workplace, so that they can be a part of the solution. So we're hearing, again, from unions across Europe, as well as from the global South, that they want to be a part of the solution, that they need it, that they need these tools to be effective. Germany has been leading the way globally with the supply chain rules in place, and we're all looking for the next opportunity for us to leverage the existing tools and to build the new ones to be able to build worker power. Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm glad I put you in that order, because that's a very positive note. Thank you for that. So this is the time I would like to turn to you again, to the audience here in the room and hopefully online. Speaking of teeth and hunger and mandatory rules, I would like to ask you again to this time answer a multiple choice question. You can enter it here again. because we want now to have a look at the obstacles. And the question is, what obstacles do you think are most prominent for co-determination in global supply chains? Maybe we can already, yeah. So part of the answers have been written by the speakers themselves. I would be interested in your perspective as well. We'll put it together in a second. Definitely enforcement gaps as the biggest obstacle in the opinion of the audience. I think that's quite a sign. Someone wants to pick that up already, or quick response?
I mean, if I would just say, I mean, in my last role, I was working for the U.S. government, leading labor policy, and I come from the labor movement, and so enforcement gaps for sure, as you heard earlier, were always the most important first step, right? Addressing and strengthening them. I think what I learned coming from the labor movement into government is, we always look at building worker capacity to advocate, to leverage, to negotiate for their rights and really build worker power. In government, there needs to be the pressure from public stakeholders, from civil society, from trade unions, for them to respond, right? Bureaucracies move slowly, they change slowly, and they really require demand from civil society in order to make shifts, particularly when they're needed. I think there needs to be the demand there for governments to enforce effectively, and I think, German unions certainly are well positioned to be the advocates here locally, but I think across supply chains, across borders, right? Union solidarity internationally is going to have to be coordinated. There needs to be both the legal capacity developed to use creative legal strategies, and there also needs to be, workers need to be empowered to be able to utilize them.
Yeah. I mean, stunning to me is that in a union event, corporate pressure seems to be not so difficult in that regard. Maybe that's something you will find astonishing, Darius. But welcome to maybe a world that functions a bit more than the US right now. Yep. But okay, I would like to open the floor now to questions. I guess we have some experts in the room, and I see already a hand. Yeah, please also use the chat for the people online. Use the chat. My colleagues will collect those as well. Please.
Hey, Sophie Rosenbohm. I'm from the University of Duisburg-Essen here in Germany, and I have a question to Darius. First of all, thank you very much for this interesting panel and for the interesting insights you presented to us today. I was wondering, I mean, Kelly was talking about the toolbox, and Mercedes is one of the global companies that has or had signed a global framework agreement and has also a global works council. So I was thinking, have you used other avenues to find a resolution for the problem? I mean, it's like the hindrance of freedom of association is not like something that is linked only to individual cases. I think in the US context, it's more like a structural problem you're facing. So have you used to raise this issue within the Global Works Council, and have you find alliances on that level to push for this issue?
So, first of all, the simple answer is yes. So here's a very interesting thing. After our major success in negotiating contracts with General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis in the fall of 2023. There was a lot of renewed interest in among all the non-union auto companies, among the workers in joining the UAW. All of a sudden, websites that had been essentially defunct for years, workers were going to them and signing union cards online and other things. So we were operating simultaneous organizing campaigns at Volkswagen and at Mercedes. And in both cases, we reached out both to IG Metall and the Works Council. And by the way, we had very negative experience with Volkswagen going back to 2013, 2014. But this time around, IG Metall was actually able to prevail on Volkswagen in Germany to actually put enough pressure on Volkswagen in the United States to call off the union busting campaign. And that is exactly why we won at Volkswagen and not at Mercedes. But let me specifically talk about that other instrument, the GFA. As I mentioned, we've been having difficulty with Volkswagen since 2014. We had 3 previous elections in Volkswagen where I could have put up essentially the same slides I put up for Mercedes about how they fought us even after promising they wouldn't, and they did it originally more by proxies and politicians because they had a sort of a paper agreement with us not to resist. But it turned out that they also had a paper agreement with the politicians, which was published in a German newspaper to actually prevent unionization at Volkswagen. But they had a global framework agreement. And we actually did not get any cooperation from them until after we prevailed on Industrial to suspend the global framework agreement. So if you will, the only value in the global framework agreement at all was suspending it. And even then, it was so many years after we suspended it that I'm not really, it may have had some influence, but so definitely direct international cooperation with IG Metall and with the Works Council was tremendously helpful at Volkswagen. The GFA was helpful only in its absence. And by the way, Mercedes has a beautiful GFA, and part of our complaint to BAFA puts in great detail all the different provisions of their own GFA that they've violated. And just one more comment on GFAs. The best GFA I have ever seen with enforceable mechanisms is Daimler Trucks. But when you read that GFA closely, it's very clear that what they did was take the document that they produced in order to come into compliance with the human rights due diligence law and basically sign that as a GFA with Industrial. Already provisions of the human rights due diligence law are going away. If more provisions go away, I think, however beautiful it looks on paper, if the German government is not enforcing those provisions, it will be as much a paper GFA as it was at Volkswagen and Mercedes.
That's a good point.
Thanks for the extensive answer. I guess that was great. Any more questions? Anyways, we're in the end, we're coming to the end of our time. Good news is that we don't have to leave immediately. We can stay in the room for a little meet and greet. I would ask the panelists for a last concise takeaway statement. Just a few seconds, please. Miriam-Lena, first, what do you expect from German and EU legislators right now?
Well, especially with regard to EU legislators, as We know that currently the CSDDD, so the European directive, is being renegotiated at the European Parliament. I would ask them to uphold the scope of the directive so that actually a fair amount of European companies are still concerned by the legislation. I would ask them to keep to keep the meaningful stakeholder involvement integrated in the directive on all stages of the due diligence process, and of course also to keep Europeanized meaningful sanctions, because things that, or a directive that doesn't have sanctions as a worst case scenario is a paper tiger.
Thanks. Kelly, what will be the first practical steps of the new center?
I mean, we're following closely the CSDDD. Obviously, it's really important that worker advocates, unions, and civil society be involved in the process, try to protect as much as possible the key provisions. I would say in closing, I mean, I've worked with workers in Bangladesh and Guatemala and South Africa. These laws on the books are incredibly important. And you all have a role to play in being able to open doors and opportunities for workers across supply chains to have access to justice. And I think, our first priority is plugging in and supporting the global unions with the most pressing, urgent, timely demands, and being able to be an added resource, strategic resource for them in building more worker power and union capacity.
Sounds great.
Yeah, thanks.
And Darius, most importantly, in your case, what outcome do you expect?
I'm not terribly optimistic, unfortunately. When we filed, we were very optimistic, specifically because this law had teeth. So we previously had a very bad experience with the OECD and Nissan. The story of Nissan in Canton, Mississippi, remarkably similar. In that case, we were hoping it would go to the Dutch National Contact Point because the Nissan Renault Alliance is incorporated in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, it went to the Japanese National Contact Point, which we learned after 5 years of this case actually has a policy of only trying to use its good offices to put the two sides together and making no determination whatsoever on the alleged facts, even if one of the parties refuses to participate in talks. So that was, so we were hoping this would be better, and now we're less optimistic than we were.
Okay, all the best in that regard. So at this point, thank you everyone. Thank you to the experts. Thank you to the audience. We heard about gaps and opportunities, and despite the overall not so positive picture, I felt lots of union solidarity in the room, and that gives me hope, to me personally. Make use of the fact that we can stay in the room for some while and take the opportunity and catch up with the speakers. Enjoy the conference. Thanks.